We have Dr. Laura McAdam, as you all know, is the lead neuromuscular physician at Holland Bloorview, and she is going to be talking to us about Duchenne in the brain. So thank you so much, Laura. I pass it over to you.
Thank you. I am just going to share my screen. Excellent. So you should be able to see it now. So yes, for the next 30 minutes or so, we are going to talk about Duchenne in the brain. And I know this came up when Dr. Dowling was presenting yesterday about Duchenne and the dystrophin gene, the DMD gene that encodes for dystrophin. And he mentioned that it is expressed in the brain. And so what I'm hoping through the next 30 minutes, I'll be able to demystify some of the impact on the brain and also highlight several of the conditions that we can see commonly in Duchenne. But I would echo what Nicholas said, not everybody with Duchenne is impacted from a neurobehavioral, neurocognitive standpoint, but there are many that are. So it's important to know what it is that we see with respect to the brain, and it's important to discuss it with your team members. So in general, dystrophin is expressed in the brain, and it has an important role in brain development and brain function. We don't know everything about this connection, and this is an area of active research right now. But the lack of dystrophin is believed to affect certain brain cells, and these are called neurons, and their ability to connect properly and share information. And a key concept is when we're talking about the brain involvement in Duchenne, this is not a progressive issue. This is something that you either have or you don't have. However, when you're looking at all of these different neurobehavioral comorbidities or conditions that we see together with Duchenne, they become evident at different ages, but it's not a progressive change from a cognitive standpoint. So one part, and this one doesn't fall within the neurodevelopmental disorders category, but it's epilepsy. So we do see a higher rate of epilepsy. And so what epilepsy is, the definition of epilepsy is multiple seizures. So seizures are a burst of uncontrolled electrical activity between the different brain cells, so those neurons, and they can look very different. So you can have bigger movements of the body, so uncontrollable jerking of the arms or legs. And this is something that's more obvious that you would notice as a parent or in a school. And it's associated with loss of consciousness or awareness, but also maybe more subtle. So staring spells or temporary confusion. And so if your child's experiencing anything from these really subtle staring spells to something that's more obvious with the jerking movements of the arms or legs, it's important to talk about this with your neuromuscular physician and just recognize that definitely not everybody with Duchenne will have seizures, but there is a slightly higher rate than in the general population. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about neurodevelopmental disorders, and within this are intellectual disability, learning disorders, ADHD, and autism spectrum disorder. And to start with this, I'm going to talk a little bit about IQ, because I think this is a really important concept to understand when I'm talking about what an intellectual disability and learning disorder is. So in an IQ, you can see here, there is a bell curve. So if I took the whole entire population and we measured what people's IQ scores were, you have this beautiful bell-shaped curve where the majority of people are in the middle, so between 85 and 115. So that is the normal range for IQ scores. Then we definitely have some individuals who are at either end of the IQ range, so individuals who have a lower IQ or individuals that have a higher IQ. Now, in Duchenne, we see this whole broad spectrum as well, but there's a little bit of a shifting of this bell curve. So instead of the average IQ score being 100, the average IQ score is hovering around 85 or 86. And so you're seeing there's this shift in IQ score. So we still absolutely have many individuals with Duchenne with very high IQs, but we have a shifting. So we have more of a tendency where we may see slightly lower IQs. And where this becomes important is when we're looking at intellectual disability. So intellectual disability is a diagnosis, and this is something that can be noted on a psychoeducational assessment, and they're looking at your IQ score, but it's apparently my mouse is definitely tricking me up today. So the IQ score is at 70 or less. So only about 2% of the general population will have an IQ score of less than 70. But when we're looking in Duchenne, up to 30% will have this. And this is where it's really going to be important when you're talking to your team. If you're noticing any learning concerns in school, or if your teacher is highlighting any learning concerns, we need to have a true understanding of how they were doing from a learning standpoint. Now, a learning disorder, that's a newer term. It is the new term for a learning disability, or some people will call it dyslexia if it's affecting reading. So we're all talking the same language. It's the broader category is called a learning disorder. And this can happen in many different areas. So for a learning disorder, your IQ is in the normal range. So that means your IQ is above 70. If it's below 70, that's where your intellectual disabilities are. If it's above 70, that's where your learning disorders are. And it can be, and this is all the way up until in the gifted area. And now it's really talking about difficulties in one or more of these areas. So it could be reading or comprehension, so understanding the meaning of what's being read. It could be in spelling, it could be in written expression. It may be more in the numerical areas, so number concepts, calculations, mathematical reasoning. And really, when you're looking at a learning disorder, it's looking at the differences in your ability to learn and where your achievement is. And this is, once again, a psychoeducational assessment will help figure out the different pieces of the learning profile. So in Duchenne, about 40% of 44%, depending on the paper you're looking at, individuals will have a learning disorder. So this is really high. When you're looking at school children in general, about 15% of school children will have a learning disorder. But in Duchenne, it's about 44%. So absolutely not everybody will have this, but many people will. So if you're hearing things from your teachers, or if as a parent, you're just saying, wow, I'm putting a lot of effort into helping them learn this next skill. I would bring that to the attention of your neuromuscular team so you can discuss what the next steps will be. And we know that within Duchenne, I've just put some comments around areas that we may see more often be affected. Not everybody with Duchenne will have these areas of their learning that are affected, but these are ones that we see more commonly. So Dr. Dowling talked about delayed language milestone achievements. So we know that some kids with Duchenne, that's actually their presenting symptom. Or it might be something that's a little bit later that's more evident. So reading, it may be just learning to read with the phonologic awareness piece, or it might be once you're already reading, not present until you're in grade 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, with that reading comprehension piece, so those higher level language skills. And so there isn't a specific age that this presents at, but it's more of those nuanced conversations that you're having with the teacher or that you're noticing at home when you're looking at their learning styles. Now, my general philosophy is if there's any question, if a parent has a question, if a school has a question, it's important to talk about getting an assessment done. So we actually truly know, is this part of their learning profile? Is this not part of our learning profile? And depending on where you are across the country, it could be done in several different places. So in schools, at least in Ontario, if there are questions around learning and children are falling behind, it's usually around grade 3 that might be done. At Holland Bloorview, I know we're very lucky because we have a psychologist that's part of our team and we're able to get learning assessments there, or it could also be done privately. So it's really asking your teams about what's available in your local environment to figure out how to get an assessment done. And the reason why it's important to have this identified is there are many strategies that can be helpful if you have a learning disorder. And it also, the psychoeducational assessments also identify strengths. So you can build on strengths to help with the areas of weakness. And there are also many educational interventions. And I know when we had our educators earlier today, they were talking about specific programs within the school systems, and it's different depending on which school system you're in. But the first thing is identifying that this may be a concern. I've included a couple of links down below, and this is the Learning Disabilities Association. And they have, one of them is a link for all across Canada, and I've also highlighted the one in Ontario. And they have different programs and parent workshops and partnering with schools and self-advocacy webinars. And so if this is part of your child's learning profile, there are a lot of resources that are available. I did see a question. I'll come to questions right at the end, just around the cost, because it is expensive. ADHD. So this is also quite common in Duchenne. And so different things that you may be noticing as a parent, or you may be hearing from school or from a detention standpoint. Do they make careless mistakes? Are they paying close attention to detail? Is it hard for them to pay attention to tasks? Now, this is the tricky one because many kids, or most kids, are quite good at paying attention to YouTube videos and paying attention to video games, or if they love Lego or have an activity they absolutely love, they will pay very close attention to it, and it will be very hard to get them to pay attention to something else. But when I'm talking about attention, it's really about a reluctance, avoidance, or disliking tasks that require mental effort. So although video games take mental effort, it's not the same mental effort when you're looking at different school-based tasks. So there's some nuances when we're talking about attention. We have the hyperactivity, so continuously moving, maybe harder to sit down at a table, or if you have a specific event and it's really hard for that individual to stay still for, they may be bouncing their knee or tapping a pencil. So their hyperactivity can look different for the individual. The impulsivity. So this is extreme impatience with others, can't wait their turn, blurting out answers or blurting out comments. It may be being aggressive in their play or destroying things and not thinking through some of those consequences, and then feeling remorseful afterwards, but really can't stop those impulsive acts. Now, as you're getting a little bit older, it can impact your executive function. So what does that mean? Those are kind of those higher order thinking. So following directions, getting confused about the steps that you need to take for a specific task, or only remembering different parts of it. Difficulty starting and completing tasks like homework. I know most kids have difficulties starting homework, but more than than other children their age. And they also really need these consistent rules because these kids are smart. They figure out strategies that work with them. And so they have, in general, can insist on things being done in a certain way because that's what works for them when they're having difficulties remembering the sequence or order of tasks. And then this emotional regulation piece. This can show, depending on your age, in many different ways. So it could be unexpected tantrums more than other children their age, or really difficulties controlling their emotions, or when they are when their emotions take over how they're feeling, it lasts for longer, it's more intense. It may be frustration or expressing frustration in an unacceptable way. And it could be just really about displaying emotions due to the inability to regulate these emotions. So being louder than other people or noisier than other people. So I just really want to give you some ideas of how ADHD can present. In Duchenne, in a recent meta-analysis, about 26% of individuals with Duchenne do have ADHD. And I think it's, once again, important to discuss with your team. And there are lots of different strategies that can be put in place at home and at school. If your child has ADHD, there can be some coaching, and there's also medication management. I've included 2 different resources here, and the top resource, the Center for ADHD Awareness, this is a Canada-wide resource, and they have information for children of different ages, for parents. They also have some parent courses, and one upcoming one is how to advocate for your child with ADHD in the Canadian school system. CADRA, some of the families that I work with, I use some of their handouts and I send that, and I use that as part of our discussion. Now, autism. So I know that's come up in other discussions as well, but we do see higher rates of autism in Duchenne. And so I am not an autism expert, but there are very specific criteria when you're looking at autism, but it's really about that social connectivity, your nonverbal communication, and the understanding of relationships. And a lot of people, there's been a lot of information in the general media about autism. And I have had many families say, oh, my child has good eye contact. That means that means their child doesn't have autism. But that isn't true. I see many people with autism and they have very good eye contact, but it's really that those social skills, maybe some repetitive movements or repetitive language, or these very intense interests, or they may have some sensory input. And what's a little bit hard with the sensory piece is many individuals with Duchenne do not have autism, but they definitely have higher sensory needs. So it's really going to be that sensory piece plus this broader definition of autism spectrum disorder. Now, 17% of boys with Duchenne have autism, so this is pretty high. And so I think if you have questions, this is where you need to bring it back to your team. And the physicians on your team may not have expertise in in all of these different areas, but they will know where to refer to get the assessments done and to determine, is this part of the picture of everything you're experiencing at home? I've included just some national organizations across the bottom with different websites and different links. And in Ontario, we do have an Ontario Autism Program, and that's linked to the funding that's available if your child has autism in addition to Duchenne. Now, we see also other comorbidities, and this is more from a psychiatric side. And so we see a lot more anxiety, about 22% in Duchenne. We can see more OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder and depression. And I really, today over the last few days, we've talked a lot about transition, and transition increases anxiety for everybody. But if you already have an anxiety disorder and you're looking at transitioning into new adult healthcare, into post-secondary education or high school or into employment, it's really important to have the right resources in place from an anxiety or depression standpoint in advance to help facilitate transition. And so it will likely mean a referral for assessment, and there are different treatment modalities out there, including therapy as well as medication. This Anxiety Canada has a lot of tools out there just talking about anxiety, what it looks like as well. And I've taken these pictures from their teen anxiety webpage, and they have an app that you can download on your teen can download on their phone. And it talks about CBT, so cognitive behavioral therapy, and it has some anxiety strategies on there. It also has my anxiety plan, so you can develop a plan. And it also has resources. So where are the resources across Canada if you feel that this is part of your child's brain and brain function? So I think it's a very helpful resource. Now, the impact. So when you're living with Duchenne, you have muscle weakness, and we know it's progressive muscle weakness, and you may or may not have one of these other comorbidities, so learning, anxiety, autism, depression, OCD. And when we put all of these together, if first of all, it needs to be recognized and determine what components are part of your brain biology. And then if we aren't addressing it, it can impact quality of life. It can lead to chronic stress. We know that it has impacts on all relationships, so not just your family, but also your friends, your peers, and professionally. There's a lot of evidence around school attendance and the impact it has, especially for anxiety and depression. And really, we want to personalize your school success. And part of that is understanding the different components or potential barriers that exist for the individual. So in conclusion, I just want to really highlight the brain is involved in Duchenne. It's important to talk to your teams about your observations and your concerns, and then they will help you navigate where to get the right resources. And it may be the physician, it may be a social worker, it may be a psychologist. There could be a broad number of individuals that can help around the diagnosis piece as well as the support piece. And the key thing is just remembering it's not progressive. However, it can present at different ages, because when we're looking at development, we don't expect to see issues in certain areas until you're a little bit older and your brain has developed in those areas. So that is it for my presentation, and I'm going to open it up to questions. I'm sorry it was a whirlwind. I was trying to squeeze a lot in a short period of time.
Thank you, Dr. McAdam. That was fantastic. We do have a couple comments in the chat box. If you like, I can read those out. So the first one's from Monica. She asks, are there specific mutations that are more prone than others to present intellectual or learning difficulties?
So that's a fantastic question. There is no one specific rule. And so say if we're looking at intellectual disability, so that is where your IQ is, 70 or below or less than the second percentile. In general, if you have a genetic change near the end of the gene, you're more likely to have that. But that only works 66% of the time. So that means 33% of the time you can have a mutation or genetic change at the end, and there are no neurocognitive issues. So there's no one specific rule. There are some really big studies now that are gathering all of the information out there, trying to give us hints or suggestions, but I can't say with one specific mutation I'll see something. I do follow families where there are multiple children and one child may have one thing and another child does not. So it's really, I wish it was that simple, but it absolutely is not. It's quite complex.
Thank you. And hopefully that answers your question, Monica. We do have a comment from Angela. She says, wait lists very long for hospital or school board psych assessment. Private can be cost prohibitive. And I know this is a big gap that we know we have in the country. Did you want to comment on that, Laura?
No, other than, I absolutely agree. I wish I didn't have to agree, but I agree. And I think depending on where you are, schools sometimes will only do it at certain grades or at certain ages, and they have some school boards have specific definitions. So you have to be 2 grades behind. And if you're thinking about learning, you've already missed so much information. It's hard. I mean, if you have private insurance, that may help defer some of the costs, but you're right. I know in Toronto, if you want a psychoeducational assessment, it's about $2,000 to $3,000 if you're paying for it independently. I wish it wasn't that expensive, but it is. So I would ask and see if there are any other local resources to help with that.
Thank you. And I know we have a few minutes left. If families want to go ahead and post their questions in the chat box, we'd love to hear from you, or we would love to pass on your questions. I do have a question for you, Dr. McAdam, and it's related to speech. And we hear a lot of Duchenne boys do have either delayed speech or have some difficulties with speech, various different difficulties. Is that related to the brain as well, or is that more of a muscle issue in the in the jaw? Like where does that fit into this?
Oh, I think it's multifactorial. So that means for many different reasons, depending on your child. So especially if you're looking at the young child, a lot of that is going to be the brain. And so when you're learning to speak language, if there are difficulties with how that language, how those language systems are developed, it is going to be the brain. But as you get a little bit older, sometimes from articulation, sometimes we can see larger tongues or tongue ties that may affect some of the articulation. But a lot of it is going to be coming from the brain and the brain circuitry. When you're looking at, language processing, and on my other slide, we also talked about working memory. And sometimes that can look like language, but working memory is how many things can we keep in our brain at one point in time. So say if you give someone 15 instructions, but you can only keep 2 in your brain, and because you have short working memory, then sometimes you may not be answering things correctly. So it may look like a language issue, but it's actually a working memory issue. And sometimes it can look like ADHD, but it's actually working memory. And so that's where it's important to have these discussions so the people you're speaking with can kind of figure out which direction it is we need to be going to help your child.
It sounds to me like it's an onion that sometimes is really hard to figure out what's going on, and I'm sure that's challenging for everybody. We do have a question from Tara. She says, "What is the best age to do learning assessment?"
I think it depends on the question. So, if you and it also depends on what you have accessible. So, if you only have money and you're paying privately, and you only have money to pay for one assessment, then it's probably going to be around grade 3, especially if we're looking at language-based learning issues, or math-based learning issues, because you need to have had enough exposure to develop those skills to truly understand what is going on. If your question is really about learning across the board, so from an intellectual disability standpoint, I find those individuals that have more of a broader learning issue, they're easily picked up through the school, and they will eventually get a learning assessment through the school, but they start the adaptations really early. I find in general, I start hearing hints of learning disabilities sometimes as early as kindergarten, but then it starts being pulled out grade 1, grade 2, especially if it's around some of the early language skills. So I think it's going to depend on your child and what you have accessible, but most will be picked up by grade 3 if you're doing a psychology assessment. And I think I saw another question about in university. And so that's probably someone who is doing very well from, if I'm just looking at quote unquote IQ, and they've figured out their own strategies, but now they've kind of tapped out where their personal strategies are actually helping them. And so I mean, sometimes it will be in high school before we get the full question of, is something going on with their learning? But definitely it can be helpful. I've had some patients that they just were not interested. And then we did, then finally just before university, they said, you know what, maybe I should do one. And then we did diagnose a learning disability, and it resulted in greater success in university. Because just because you have a learning disability does not mean, like, there's so many people out there that have learning disabilities that may not even know, and they are so successful in life. It's just really, is it hindering you, and trying to diagnose it so that you can be more successful in the endeavors you want to be doing.
No, absolutely. And I mean, we have enough challenges as it is. This is one piece that if we can diagnose it early, start to work, develop some tools and strategies to get us through that, it'll definitely help us all out in the long term. So thank you so much, Dr. McAdam. That was really, really great. I really appreciate that. I know our families really appreciate that as well. And also we really do appreciate all the support and the advocacy that you do for our families. So thank you again. So with that, we will close this session. We will now move into our last session before we close the day on research and development part 2. So I look forward to seeing you all in that session shortly. Thank you very much, everybody.